Previously, we've worked with the work with pattern and saw how to apply it and the functionalities it implements. Now let's see some examples that will enable us to learn more about the possibilities we have. To do so, we will go over some of the transactions we have in our travel agency application. The country transaction that records countries and their respective cities, and the attraction transaction that records tourist attractions. We've applied the work with pattern to the country transaction, and the idea is to also show on the main screen the number of tourist attractions for each country. As we already know, if we navigate through countries, then it's possible for each country to trigger a count formula to count the number of tourist attractions that the country has. So our question is, where must we declare the formula to obtain the result we expect? We must edit the instance of the work with pattern applied to the country transaction and declare, under the attributes node, the quantity variable. In its properties, we must indicate, in addition to its description, the domain on which its data type is based. It's important to point out that it's not possible to assign a data type directly to it. We need to base the variable's definition on a domain. We then define a domain, also called quantity. And lastly, we declare the code that will assign value to that variable in the load code property. This will enable the pattern to include, in the load event of the www country web panel, the assignment to the quantity variable of the count formula we've just defined here. We press F5. Then we select Work with Country to view the new column in the grid with the number of attractions recorded for each country. Let's now suppose that, in addition to viewing the number of attractions per country, we want to add a new column to deploy either one of two texts for each country, depending on the number of attractions that that country has. It will read, many attractions for countries whose number of attractions is greater than 3, or few attractions for all other cases. Again, from the instance of the pattern, we now define a new comment variable. And here we declare the corresponding code. This code will be automatically added in the load event of the www country web panel. So, upon pressing F5, we will be viewing this new column with the corresponding text. Let's then press F5. We select Work with Country, and for each country we see the corresponding text. Now we want to define a button in the www country screen to invoke a PDF listing. That is to say, a previously defined procedure object. Thus, we've designed the attractions per country listing that will enable us to view tourist attractions grouped by country. Again, we edit the instance of the work with pattern applied to the country transaction, but this time we define an action. In order to create the Actions node, from the Selection node, we right-click and select Add Actions. This is how we create the new node Actions. Now we stand on this new node. And once again, we right-click to select Add Action. In the properties associated with the action, we declare the name, the caption, and the GeneXus to be invoked, which in our case corresponds to the PDF listing called Attractions per Country. The pattern will then generate the event associated with the button by invoking the object declared. All that's left is to press F5. We select Work with Country and we'll see the button generated. We press it to view the listing. Now let's go to a basic concept when it comes to working with patterns. Once the Work With pattern has been applied to a transaction, a dynamism is established. This means that the structure of the transaction, the instance of the pattern applied, and the objects generated are all synchronized. So, if we add a new attribute to the structure of the transaction, it'll be automatically viewed in the instance of the pattern applied, and also automatically, it will be added to the objects generated. Therefore, it'll be viewed when the application is executed. Likewise, if an attribute is removed from the structure of the transaction, it'll be automatically removed from the instance of the pattern applied and from the GeneXus objects generated. Let's then get back to our application. We've decided to add to the structure of the country transaction the new attribute country flag of the image type to also view the flag of each country. So we declare this new attribute. Then we save the changes. If we now edit the instance of the Work With pattern applied, we will see that the new attribute appears automatically. This leads us to think that it will also be viewed automatically in runtime. To verify this, we press F5. And select Work With Country. So what happens if we manually edit the objects generated by the application of the pattern? In other words, what happens if, for example, we open the www country web panel and edit its form? Do we add any control or modify anything? The dynamism between the instance and the object generated is lost. This means that the definitions that may later be done in the instance of the pattern will no longer be applied in the www country screen, and they will have to be defined manually. Is it possible to recover the dynamism lost? Yes, it is possible. Let's see an example of this. We will now edit the www country web panel. For example, we drag a button from the toolbox and we know that we have lost the dynamism between the instance of the pattern and this object generated. To recover it, with this www country web panel open, we go to the Edit menu and select Apply Default, All Parts. Then in this case, we are recovering the dynamism between the instance and the object generated for all parts. But the dynamism is lost and may be recovered in parts. If, as we just mentioned in our example, a button is added manually in the form of www country, but nothing was edited in its conditions or events, then the dynamism was only lost in what relates to the form, but it remains elsewhere. So at the time of deciding to recover the dynamism, we may opt to recover all of it, for which case we select the option Apply Default All Parts, or to only recover it in what relates to the part of the object that is open, in this case the web form. It's important to bear in mind that when we decide to recover dynamism, the object is generated again from the instance, and all changes made manually are lost. Now, let's find the general definitions that are automatically applied for each pattern. That is to say, all the initializations set by default for them. By selecting the View Preferences, under the Patterns node, we have settings of default values for the properties of each pattern. With these default values, they initialize the properties at the time of creating the instances. This is the reason why, if we return to the instance of the pattern applied to the country transaction, we will see that, for some properties, the default value appears. And this means that the property has inherited the default value of the pattern's general setting. We can then conclude that it's possible to locally modify the values of the properties for a specific instance. Or here, at the general level, if we want to modify the generic initialization. Let's see an example of this. Let's suppose that we want to remove from the WW country screen the possibility to enter new countries. We must edit the instance of the pattern associated with this country transaction, and for the node that offers the modes to execute the transaction, in the property corresponding to the insert mode, we select the false value. On the other hand, if we wanted to establish that, for all default work widths, the possibility of new entries not to be allowed, then we must perform this general configuration from here. This means that all instances will be initialized with the property corresponding to the insert mode with value false. To end, we will now see how to remove the application of the work with pattern from a transaction. We must delete the objects generated by the pattern. So, from the folder view window, and in this case under the country transaction, we select work with country and press delete. This will cause the automatic deletion of all objects generated by the application of the work with pattern, and will also uncheck the box apply this pattern on save, which will enable the possibility of applying it again in the future.